So the news is in. Danny Jacobs will fight Gennady Golovkin March the 18th, 2017 at Madison Square Gardens. When the news broke, I got contacted by quite a lot of people on social media asking for some thoughts on it. People are clearly very excited for the fight, so I wanted to discuss my opinions on it. Just when I mention social media, I've put the links to my social media in the description box below. Please follow me on Twitter at Boxing Gossip or add me on Facebook using the link provided. But yeah, let's talk about the fight itself. Gennady Golovkin versus Danny Jacobs. I think most of us would agree that if we look at the middleweight division right now, the number one rated middleweight has to be Gennady Golovkin, both in terms of resume and in terms of visual appearance in the ring and looking like he most likely has the beating of the other guys in the division. When we look beyond when we look beyond Gennady Golovkin and we say who is the number two rated middleweight in the division, there's a discussion to be had. But I think logically, the person who at this precise second you would have to rate number two in the division is Daniel Jacobs. Now, there's probably some differing opinions on who should fill that spot, but I think Danny Jacobs certainly deserves, realistically, to be in with a fair discussion of having that position. So this is to be applauded in that sense, because here you have the number one in the division versus, in my opinion, probably on balance, the number two in the division. And that's what we like within boxing. This is always an ideal situation and scenario when a fight like this is made and we're going to find out who is the best out of the top two in the division. And certainly on paper, Daniel Jacobs is a very, very credible opponent. He has 32 wins, with 29 of those wins coming by way of knockout. So we're talking about a guy here with a very, very high KO percentage, an 88% KO percentage. He's only got one loss, and he's aged 29. So we're not talking about a guy at the end of his career, at the autumn of his career. We're talking about a guy in the peak of his life. We're talking about a guy with a very, very high knockout percentage. We're talking about a guy with a credible record who had the biggest win of his career only 2 fights ago against Peter Quillen. Now, Quillen's a difficult fighter to assess. His dedication to the sport was regularly in doubt. His attitude was regularly in doubt. His heart has at times been in doubt. But for my money, Peter Quillen was probably the number two middleweight in the division prior to his loss to Danny Jacobs. Quillen was always a guy I rated fairly highly, and I always thought that on his day, Peter Quillen was a very, very tricky fighter who possessed a lot of skills, some power, and a lot of attributes to cause problems for the top middleweights. And Danny Jacobs dispatched of him in fairly devastating fashion, as you guys will recall. So, for me, Danny Jacobs has to hold that position as number two middleweight in the division. And there's other wins on his resume. I mean, let's face it, his resume historically isn't a list of absolute star names, but Jared Fletcher, Caleb Truax, Sergio Mora twice. He's been in and around the higher levels of the sport. If you go further back, Issei Smith, one or two other names in there as well. So I think it's a good fight. Jacobs, 6 foot tall. He's an aggressive fighter. He's someone who, despite his reasonable size for the middleweight division, he's not someone who you necessarily think about as, jabbing and running and moving and boxing long for an entire fight. He's quite an aggressively minded fighter. He's got a bit of seek and destroy in him, and that's potentially intriguing against GGG. However, when you actually start looking at the fight and you start thinking about who's going to win the matchup, despite the fact that this is on balance the number one and number two in the middleweight division, I still believe it's hard to make a case for Danny Jacobs to make the upset here. Danny Jacobs' one loss, which I referred to earlier on in the video, came at the hands of Dmitry Pirog. Now, Pirog, much forgotten about really because of how his career developed, and obviously he suffered very, very bad injuries which kept him out of the ring, but Pirog fought Jacobs back in 2010, and Pirog stopped Jacobs, as we know. Jacobs was pretty badly knocked out. And more recently, Questions relating to Danny Jacobs' durability have come to the fore again when he fought Sergio Mora. Now, Sergio Mora is a guy who is known as a relatively light puncher and a guy who's actually operated in the division below at light middleweight. Yet he dropped Danny Jacobs fairly heavily at one point in their fight. And it just served to remind me of that Pirog loss. If I'm completely honest, I actually thought Peter Quillen would knock Danny Jacobs off. I thought Peter Quillen is such a big power puncher and he's such good skill stuff that at some point in their fight, Quillen would find a home on Jacobs' chin, and Quillen would have too much power and too much precision for Danny Jacobs. Now that didn't actually happen because the fight was over so quickly that Danny Jacobs, I guess you could say, pretty much walked through Peter Quillen, and I think the fight was over in the first round, wasn't it? So whilst that was a very, very visually impressive performance, and whilst Danny Jacobs deserves immense credit for dispatching of Peter Quillen so quickly, it is perhaps one of those fights where you can't necessarily say that it was a full and complete test. So that's my concern going into this Golovkin fight. Fundamentally, my concern relates to durability. Golovkin's going to hit Jacobs hard and often, and I have doubts as to whether Jacobs will stand up to the test. As I say, Jacobs was wiped out by Dmitry Pirog, and since then, the only elite middleweight he's been in with, Peter Quillen, the fight was over so quickly that it didn't actually represent a stern test. And against the semi-elite fighters like Sergio Mora, those durability questions have resurfaced. Now, on ranking alone, Danny Jacobs, you could arguably say, deserves to be higher than the British middleweights. He deserves to be higher. You could make a case he deserves to be higher than Billy Joe Saunders. I mean, Billy Joe Saunders' biggest wins are Andy Lee and Kushubank Jr. You could say that the win over Peter Quillen was a better win than either of those two wins, and I'd find it hard to disagree with that. I think Peter Quillen, on balance, had achieved a higher level of form than Andy Lee, who he drew with, and Kushubank Jr. But I do believe that Billy Joe Saunders would potentially be more of a test for Golovkin than Danny Jacobs. And I'm not saying I picked Billy Joe to beat Gennady Golovkin, not at all. And Billy Joe's last performance, as you guys will know, was pretty low standard of stuff. So based on that, certainly he'd have no chance against Gennady Golovkin. But I think stylistically on his day, Billy Joe Saunders would pose a bigger threat. I mean, what Danny Jacobs brings to the table is a high knockout ratio, big power, and quite an aggressive, outgoing mentality, which Billy Joe Saunders possibly doesn't bring. Billy Joe Saunders is more of a back foot, southpaw, tricky fighter. But Billy Joe Saunders has that undefeated resume. He's proven a good chin time and time again. And I think that his awkward slickness would cause problems for Golovkin. Kushubank Jr., another guy, you certainly couldn't make a case on resume he's on the level of Billy Joe Saunders or Daniel Jacobs. But Kushubank Jr. is another guy who's shown great durability in his career so far, and he's a very big, tough guy who, really forces the pace in a fight. And again, I think that could be interesting. The problem with Danny Jacobs for me is he's a guy who's going to come forward. He's a guy who's going to be all action. He's a guy who's going to be very aggressive. He's going to be throwing bombs. But we know when he throws bombs, he's susceptible to getting caught. And those questions remain as to how he reacts when he does get caught. Will he be able to stand up to the power? Will he be able to live with it? And based on the form that we've seen to date, based on the fact he was knocked out by Dmitry Pirog, based on the fact that he was dropped by Sergio Mora, based on the fact he didn't really have to prove any durability against Peter Quillen, I think on balance the chances are that he's not going to be able to live with Gennady Golovkin. And I actually think the style he brings to the ring is pretty tailor-made for Golovkin. We've seen what Golovkin did against David Lemieux previously, and I wouldn't be surprised if the fight was reminiscent of that. But I'm not sure it will go as long, actually. I think Danny Jacobs may be susceptible to the power of Gennady Golovkin early on. And whilst I applaud the fight for being made, for it being the 1 and 2 in the division on balance, I don't see it as a competitive fight. And I'm sorry to be down on it. I'm not down on it. I mean, I'm sorry to not be overly excited about it, because it's always good to see a 1 and 2 in a division fighting. But for me, it's just not going to be a fight that I think could legitimately go both ways. I think guys like Billy Joe Saunders and Chris Eubank Jr. stylistically would provide tougher tests at this stage. Let me know your thoughts. How do you see this fight going? Are you excited? Are you looking forward to this matchup? Do you see it as competitive? Could Danny Jacobs score the upset here? Who are you picking to win and how? Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. And if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. Many thanks indeed for watching, guys.